Latinos are the most influential population group right now in the US. And I'm going to talk about audiences. I was asked to talk about how Latinos are changing the face of what the US means. My name is Salvador Acevedo. I think I can say Salvador here instead of Salvador. And I've been working for the last 15 years with audiences trying to figure out how more Latinos, more different population groups can engage with cultural institutions. So what I'm interested in talking about today is the future. We've heard already some ideas on how things are changing, how artists are imagining our future. I'm going to talk about now how we think the population, people out there on the streets are changing the face of the US. And for this, I'm using a methodology called strategic foresight, which basically means looking at population trends and trying to understand what is going to happen in the future based on what we're seeing today. The future is not one thing, could be many things and different paths. So I'm going to show you different paths that we think, we imagine could happen in the future. So the question that I'm going to try to address today is how Latinos are changing what it means to be American. I don't think the question is how Latinos are becoming American, but how Latinos are changing what it means to be American. So strategic foresight looks at the influence of different population groups, of different trends in society that could be described as a curve in which there's an exponential growth. And this curve has different stages, different steps. We looked at the fringe. We look at the next step, which is the edge, when things are starting to be noticed. Then realm of cool, when things, and especially this is the stage in which artists are recognized as trendsetters, things are happening, things are starting to change. Then the next big thing, when society at large start to understand, oh, there's something coming up, there's a change coming up. And then social convention, which is basically when things become normalized, right? What I think is that Latinos, we are now on the next big thing stage. I'm gonna use certain moments in our history, in a recent history, to explain this influence. I'm going to talk about seminal moments in the US cultural imagination for this, but there are many different moments, and many of you can point at different moments. So this is what I call the path of Hispanization of American dominant culture. So we can start in the 60s, in the fringe moments when, for example, Rita Moreno wins the Oscar, or Cesar Chavez creates the the union, the Agricultural Workers Union. Then in the 70s, 80s, Miami becomes officially a bilingual city. In 86, Reagan signs the Immigration Reform Act. And 98, for example, salsa is approved as a vegetable in the schools. This might sound like a trivial thing, but imagine at that point ketchup was not allowed in the schools, and there was this fight between salsa and ketchup. And all of a sudden, we Latinos, our salsa is accepted, and that's become part of the population imagination. That's the point here. Then in 2001, Latinas become recognized as creators of small businesses. The US has always been focused on small businesses as the core of society, and Latinas become the record number creators of small businesses. Tequila becomes mainstream. Right now, nobody thinks of tequila as a Mexican beverage. It's pretty much mainstream. Everybody drinks tequila. And then in 2003, Latinos become the largest minority. You know, that had huge impact at all levels, so social, political, economical. Things changed completely when we became the largest minority. And now, more recently, in 2008, the Latino vote was recognized as critical to win elections with Obama's election. The Latino vote was important ever since Kennedy back in the 60s, but in 2008, it was recognized by everybody in the country that you cannot win elections without the Latino vote. In 2009, Sonia Sotomayor was appointed to the Supreme Court, which becomes the highest ranking official in the administration. And in 2016, right now, we know that Latinos own digital trends. This is technology. We know that technology is one of the most important trends that are changing the face of society, how we interact with each other. And 10 years ago, we talked about the digital divide, in which Latinos were the lowest connected population. And now, just 10 years later, we Latinos skipped the desktop, went straight to mobile, and now Latinos are the highest users of social media, the highest users of video and music via mobile, and purchases on mobile devices. We are at the forefront of the digital revolution right now. So after all this happens, what are the potential outcomes that will emerge from this path? And I apologize, my voice is kind of shaky, I don't know why. So what I'm interested is in looking what's next, what's gonna happen now that we're seeing this huge influence of the Latino population in the American imagination. So for that, I'm gonna use a concept that we developed through a number of studies, audience studies, that I call the Latino Paradox. Oftentimes when I'm talking with audiences, in interviews or focus groups, I hear people saying, I'm 100% Hispanic and I'm 100% American. And there's no contradiction in this. I'm gonna talk in a minute about what this is. So going back to a strategic foresight, using a methodology called critical uncertainties, we developed 4 different scenarios of what we think could happen in the future. I don't have time to explain how we did this, but basically we used 2 categories. Racial identity, which basically is how people look at me, how people perceive me, and cultural identity, which is basically how I identify myself, right? So for that, based on those 2 categories, we defined 4 different scenarios. Scenario 1 is what I call black and white, and it's a situation in which the race identity is strong, but the cultural identity is weak. Then scenario 2, brown people, in which race and cultural identity are both strong. Then scenario 3 is Americano or Americana, in which race identity is weak, but cultural identity is strong. And finally, scenario 4, Kumbaya, which race and cultural identity are both weak, okay? So scenario 1, black and white. Basically, in this scenario, what it's gonna happen is that we're gonna keep this split between white and black, but what is going to happen is that Hispanics will also split. White Hispanics, the ones that can pass for whites, are going to identify as whites, and the ones that the skin color is darker are going to have to identify with blacks or with somebody else. And we see this already happening in a lot of situations. So what is going to happen is that white Hispanics will maintain the privilege. There's going to be elevated tension and conflicts, and then fringe groups will emerge. Basically, black Hispanics identifying with African Americans, or even creating their own different groups. Now, brown people is a situation in which both racial and cultural identity are strong. So what happens is the emergence of the third race. We've been talking about brown people for a long time, but I'm talking about at a population level. So the emergence of a third race will mean that the idea of mestizaje will be accepted. You know, it's always been very interesting to me that there's no word in English for mestizaje, which basically means the fusion of different cultures. So we'll finally accept mestizaje, and then other groups, other brown people groups, will join this category, gaining a lot of influence and getting control of resources through that. Then we have scenario 3, in which cultural identity remains very strong, but racial identity is not that much. So this is a situation in which Hispanics will unify through this idea of the Latino paradox. I'm 100% American and I'm 100% Latino. And there's a racing balance. There's a new cultural group that is not Latino, is not Hispanic, and it's not American. It's the fusion of both of them. And we will see these particularly in specific regions. California, Texas, even Florida will become the epicenter, the symbolic epicenter of this new identity, Americano. And that will also change the language, culture, and traditions. Finally, scenario 4, which is, in my point of view, the most unlikely, in which culture and race become unimportant. We transcend culture and race, and identity will be based in other factors like age, socioeconomic group, even technology use. So we, for example, will see identities based on urban mentality or mindset, or the use of technology. And then heritage, cultural heritage remains important, but becomes something more of a nostalgic point of view. So futurism, strategic foresight, is a little bit of using your imagination to see what can happen. But what I'm trying to say here is that with any of these 4 different scenarios, and what I think it's already happening is that a combination of these 4 different scenarios is changing the way that we understand American culture, either through the emergence of a third race or through the emergence of a very specific cultural group with its own language, its own imagination, its own traditions, solidify in different regions, right? So we know that cultural institutions are a representation of the social convention, right? Cultural institutions are more on the avant-garde, are probably looking at the fringe groups, at the realm of cool, at the next big thing, but usually social convention is what museums and mainstream cultural institutions are about. So no surprise they are way behind in this curve of influence, but that has to change, and that's one of the reasons why we are here. Thank you very much.